It's been nearly a year since I moved back to the States from Taiwan. As is all too common for Americans moving back home, and especially coming from the well-conducted countries in Europe and East Asia, the faults of our beautiful country haven't been easy to ignore. To compare my previous and current countries, here in America, there are far fewer restaurants. They're far more expensive, and they're usually less delicious. Another example. I dislocated my elbow once in both countries, although I won't derail this intro with those stories. And while the experience of getting my arm fixed was a bit smoother in America, after all, they don't hand out morphine quite so wantonly in Taiwan, the price was fully 30 times higher in the American hospital. Last example, of course, trains. I bought my first car ever last year at the age of 31, because for the last 8 years living in Taiwan and China, robust taxi, bus, subway, and bike systems made cars almost a hassle for everything but nature excursions, perhaps, and getting from one city to another was always possible via comfortable, frequently running, reasonably priced, high-speed rails that topped 120 miles per hour. Anyone who's visited Europe or Japan will likely have had the same experience. Now look, I do truly love America, and I could easily make a long list of things I prefer here. For example, a bunch of people here speak English, and I'm much less likely, I think, to get randomly missiled. But because I love America, I want, like any patriot, for my country to improve. On the surface, a high-speed rail system seems like an obvious investment and a clear improvement. But as always in debate, things are rarely as clear-cut as good and bad. And as with any good debate topic, there will be trade-offs. There is no such thing as free rail. So, we're well on track to have a great debate season this year. I'm excited to now introduce to you HSR investment. Enjoy. Before we begin, a note as usual on the evidence. The evidence referenced in this lecture can be purchased as a brief from our website, debatetrack.com. These fees help to keep DebateTrack running and help to make these lectures free for everyone. Even though they do take me several days to make, the last thing I'd want to do is to put these lectures behind a paywall. So, your support means a lot to me, and it helps to support debate and education in America and beyond. However, I don't want money to be the reason you can't afford the brief. So if you truly cannot afford it, please send me an email and I can help you out. Another note on the evidence. I've included source blocks for two particular sources, Randal O'Toole, a former Cato researcher, and the Reason Foundation, both of whom have been accused of being sullied by oil money. Although I believe that good arguments should stand on their own despite who said them. I encourage you to read through these cards, although I won't address them again in this lecture. This lecture, as you can see, will be broken down into a few parts. First, we'll discuss definitions in the resolution, then background, then make a foray around the world's HSR systems, a couple places anyway, as a point of comparison, then touch on the status quo of trains in America. Next, we'll talk about arguments proper for pro first and then for con. And as usual, we will hit on some, not all, but just a few rebuttals that you might hear or that you might use for the common pro and con arguments. So, let's begin. Here is your resolution. The United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in high-speed rail. Before we talk about definitions, I'd like to point out that you probably already understand 90% of the definition. America should build more fast trains, right? And breaking down each of the words in the resolution may seem pedantic, given that it's an easy resolution to understand. However, the subtleties and nuances are worth mentioning and thinking about as we attack this resolution from all angles. I do not advocate using obscure readings of the definitions to try to win rounds, or getting involved in drawn-out definitions debates. Nevertheless, I hope my brief thoughts can help some of you to think through your strategy just a little bit better. First, the Fed. Our actor is the US federal government. In order to build the national HSR system that many dream of, we'd need the coordination, authority, and most importantly, the cash money of the federal government. That's how China built its system, that's how China builds everything, and how the US built its incredible highway system. Now, of course, there are other ways to build things, namely state and local governments, especially for more regional HSR projects, and notably private investment, like the Bright Line trains in Florida. And these alternatives may be better than the federal government. But for Pro, this is what you're advocating: action by the US federal government. Substantially. This word always kind of trips me up. Is a substantial increase just a lot more than now? That's what it seems like to me. That said, given our minimal HSR system in the status quo, it wouldn't take that much investment to get to substantial. But to throw some numbers around, in 2009, Congress authorized $10.1 billion for the high-speed intercity passenger rail program, the last major national HSR investment in America. Some of the projects that money went to are still ongoing. And more recently, the Biden administration's massive infrastructure bill allotted $80 billion to rail, not specifically to high-speed rail, but to rail in general, and much of it to maintenance and overhauls of existing systems. So, to hit substantial, those are the numbers we should be looking to beat. However, that said, many of the most ambitious plans you'll see have rails crisscrossing the country every which way, and in order to be substantial, it's certainly not necessary to go all that far. Our next word is increase. Again, the US doesn't have much HSR rail to begin with, although in other countries, investments could be made in maintaining or upgrading existing lines. In the US, any substantial increases would have to be done by building more lines, because we just don't have much to begin with. A technical question for the debate may be if Biden's infrastructure bill counts as substantial increase. The money has been approved, but it also hasn't been used, so this $80 billion for rail is in a kind of limbo as far as debate definitions goes. Does that money count as our increase, and Pro can simply argue that it was a good bill to pass, or does Pro have to advocate for additional spending beyond the $80 billion? Investment. This resolution doesn't give us any success criteria by which to judge the government's investment. So the only requirement for Pro is to show that the investment itself is good, not that the HSR will have any specific benefits after the money is spent. This technically opens the door for arguments that spending itself is good, for job creation, the economy, etc., regardless of how the project turns out in the end. Of course, this argument would be pretty silly, but it might be worth pointing out. Another important note, the resolution asks about federal government investment, but not federal building or operating of the rails. So any part of the design, planning, construction, operation, and or maintenance of this HSR system could be done through contracting private companies or working with state and local governments. But the investment itself, for our purposes, must come from the Fed. And finally, HSR. So high-speed rail is defined primarily by speed. And although there's no one definition for the speed, the most common standard for HSR is trains with a top speed of 200 kilometers per hour, which is about 124 miles per hour. Although minimum speeds range from 180 kilometers per hour on the low end to 250 kilometers per hour on the high end. But the standard number is 200 kilometers per hour. At the real extreme end, the US Department of Transportation defines regional HSR as those with a top speed of 144 kilometers per hour, or 90 miles per hour. While this is indeed fairly fast for a train, it doesn't meet any international definitions for HSR. But you maybe can see the appeal, right? One easy way to turn all of your trains into high-speed trains is to just redefine the word. All right, that's enough definitional nonsense. Let's go to background. First, here are some of the terms and technologies you should be familiar with. Then we should talk about this almost high-speed rail, the middle ground between conventional trains and true HSR, and then a couple notes on how these trains are integrated into cities. So, terms. First, gauge. What is a gauge? A track gauge is how far apart the wheels are on the train. Also, how far the tracks are, because the wheels have to sit on the tracks. There is an international standard gauge used in most places around the world, but also non-standard gauges that you may hear referenced in the evidence. These different systems are, for example, why trains cannot easily go to Russia, which uses a non-standard track gauge. Because of its high speed, HSR needs a number of technologies that aren't commonly used on normal trains, and we'll talk about a couple of these in the next section. Existing tracks, though, existing normal train tracks can be upgraded to high speed, thus hitting speeds of up to 200 kilometers per hour, but specialty HSR track is really ideal, although far more expensive, and can help trains reach even higher speeds of 250 kilometers per hour or way faster than that. The vast majority is classic train technology with a bunch of upgrades for safety and speed. HSR is not magical. Well, maybe a little bit, but it's not that magical. It's just a cool train. However, there are two other technologies that enable ultra high speed, those being Maglev and Hyperloop. So Maglev technology, as the name implies, uses electromagnets to actually levitate the entire train above the track, thus reducing friction to only friction from air and enabling a smoother and faster ride. The Shanghai Maglev, for example, reaches speeds of 430 kilometers per hour, 270 miles per hour. That is the fastest in the world. Then Hyperloop, a bit less serious than Maglev, but worth mentioning. Hyperloop technology, which was made famous by Elon Musk, puts passenger pods in tubes, carefully controlled tubes with either little air pressure, so something like a vacuum to reduce air friction, or with some extra pressure and fans to help propel it along. This technology is thus far unproven, but is being tested by various groups. One very interesting side note for my hero, Elon Musk. One journalist has claimed that Elon Musk pumped up the project just to discourage building of HSR lines in California. After all, why waste all the money for an HSR when Elon Musk will hyperloop up the state, even though maybe he never actually intended to build it? All right, let's talk about almost high-speed rail. This will become fairly important in one of our arguments in the con section. Higher speed rail, also known as medium speed rail, high performance, or almost high speed rail, refer to fast intercity lines that do not qualify as HSRs, but are nonetheless pretty fast. Oftentimes, these trains use standard tracks where either the tracks or the train cars themselves, these train cars are known as rolling stock. If you see that in the evidence, rolling stock is just the train. How those are improved. This can be done through equipping the trains with electronic signaling, because it's hard to see like trackside signals when you're speeding past them. You could rebuild the tracks with shallower curves and rebuild the tracks with concrete ties instead of the usual wooden ties that you've probably seen. You can use tilting trains that can take curves at higher speeds, or you can just put fewer stops along the route so that there is a greater average speed along the route. There are obvious implications for this debate. Aspiring to medium speed trains could entail massive investments and upgrades to the US's train system, but at much lower cost than true HSR. This may be the biggest alternative that cons should not advocate for, of course, but certainly keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about integration. There are two, well, we'll talk about two, important considerations in integrating HSR with cities and communities and roads. First, intermediate stations. So, of course, every city an HSR goes through would want a station, because it'd be pretty frustrating to have a beautiful new HSR going through your town and not be able to use it because, you know, the closest station's 50 miles away. However, every stop you add will make this train much less high speed because it has to stop. So that's, you know, kind of the whole point of the thing is to be fast. So there is some obvious trade-off here. The classic compromise here is to put stations at many cities, but offer express trains that skip many of the stops, thus catering to two groups of passengers, people who live at those stations and people who just want to get between the two major cities more quickly. Next, crossings. So normal trains, as you've likely seen if you have ever been in a car, usually cross roads directly at grade, meaning cars must stop when the train goes through. You know, if they don't, well, there's plenty of videos of this online. The opportunities for collisions between trains and vehicles open up. So, but high-speed rails are built without at-grade crossings, usually. That's what they aim for, meaning that crossings will be in a tunnel under the road or a bridge over the road, keeping the train fast, keeping traffic moving, and ensuring that trains never have the chance to hit unfortunate trucks. It's usually trucks in the videos or school buses. Okay. Scary thought. HSRs are safe. Normal trains may not be. About 30 countries around the world have some high-speed rail. Again, this means rails that are in excess of 200 kilometers per hour. And the bulk of the tracks around the world are in China, as you can see, Japan, and Europe. In North America, only the US has some high-speed rail. We'll talk about that a bit later. While Mexico and Canada have no such systems, despite some studies and plans for HSR lines in both countries, Canada and Mexico, being underway. First, Japan. Japan is very much the OG of high-speed rails, having the highest ridership in the world until being overtaken by China in 2011. The Shinkansen is known as the bullet train in English, but actually it's quite similar to the rest of the world's HSR systems. You could call them all bullet trains because they've all borrowed from Japan's success and many decades of experience. The train upgrades were built on a foundation of train culture in Japan. So it might be hard to sell to have people switch from cars to trains, but it's much easier to have people switch from their usual train to a better and faster train. Like, hey, why not? I'm taking the train anyway, let's take the fast train. And so Japan had this good train culture as a starting point when they built their HSR. In Japan's long history of HSR, there has been not a single derailment nor a single passenger fatality, showing that HSR can be run extraordinarily safely, although only Japan is Japan. China, though, is the true god of HSR trains. Not just better than the competition, but way, way better than the competition. China has fully 2/3 of all HSR lines on Earth, having completed all major routes between major cities 14 years ago in 2008. But they're hardly done. They're trying to double their total lines by 2035. And given China's record with infrastructure projects, they'll probably do it. In addition, they've pioneered new train technology, not just that learned from Japan, including one autonomous train line that clocks in at 350 kilometers per hour at top speed, the fastest autonomous train in the world. Let me read a few excerpts from Jones 22 about China's HSR system. On some routes, more than 80% of the track is elevated, soaring above densely packed cities and valuable agricultural land on endless concrete viaducts. More than 100 tunnels, each over 10 kilometers, have also been bored, along with spectacular long-span bridges thrown over natural obstacles, such as the Yangtze River. China's ambition is to make high-speed rail the mode of choice for domestic long-distance travel, but these new railways have a much greater significance. Much like Japan's Shinkansen in the 1960s, they're a symbol of the country's economic power, rapid modernization, growing technological prowess, and increasing prosperity. For China's ruling Communist Party and its leader Xi Jinping, high-speed rail is also a powerful tool for social cohesion, political influence, and the integration of disparate regions with distinct cultures into the mainstream. Although its trains are now amongst the fastest in the world, China is also spending billions of dollars on Maglev technology, which will allow it to operate passenger services at up to 620 kilometers per hour, well beyond the current limits of steel wheels on steel rails. End quote. That's Jones 22. This is what many Americans aspire to, and what drives home, along with so much else, how far behind China America is in so many ways. All right, let's go to Europe. As you can see from this transparent map that you can't see, Europe is very well covered with HSR lines. The bulk of these lines in terms of distance are in the larger and richer countries, Germany, France, UK, Spain, Italy, but other countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Nordic countries have also have well-established HSR networks. On the map, any of the brown lines are under 200 kilometers per hour, so not technically high speed, although it's worth noting that the difference between conventional passenger trains at 120 kilometers per hour or so and the 200 kilometer per hour technical cutoff is pretty huge. In other words, a train limited to only 180 kilometers per hour is still pretty damn fast, and some of these lines are those quick but not technically high-speed lines. By the same token, European countries east of Poland, with the exception of Turkey, Greece, and a tiny stretch between Hungary and Serbia, have no true high-speed rails. Now, let's turn our attention to the status quo. Before that, let's take a look at some comparisons between the juggernaut of high-speed rail and the US. The US is compared to all three of these places, particularly when we're talking about Europe, Western Europe, where the bulk of the rail is. The US is sparsely populated, not many people given how giant the American country is. America has very limited train culture. I would just ask you listening, when's the last time you rode on a train? I know there's someone out there watching this from a train. I'm not talking to you, okay? But for most of you, you haven't ridden on a train anytime recently. Who does that? Quick side note, I took a train last time, a couple months ago, from south of San Francisco to LA. One of the most beautiful train rides I've ever taken. It's amazing. It goes from Seattle to, I think, almost to Mexico. And I encourage you, if you're ever in California, you want something really cool to do, especially if you've got to travel anyway, take that train. It's really nice. And also importantly, America is notoriously bad at infrastructure. This is just a fact, and we will certainly be talking more about that later. Let's turn our attention to the status quo in the US, where HSR-wise, we don't have much going on at all. In fact, the only operational HSR in the US is the Amtrak line between Boston and Baltimore that operates trains called the Acela with top speeds above 200 kilometers per hour. So, hey, that checks out. It is actually high-speed rail. Now, the Acela has some limited successes. It exists, and that is amazing, but it shares track with conventional rail, including at-grade crossings of roads, meaning its actual operational speed is much slower than its potential top speed and doesn't actually make trips a ton faster than the normal trains it shares tracks with. One exception is really long trips, so maybe you could make a trip that would normally take 8 hours and 6 hours, but even then, it's not, a mind-blowing difference. That said, YouTube comments seem to suggest that people really love the Acela, and I don't know how to say that. And given that it's the US's first high-speed line, it's certainly an important symbol of what's possible for HSR rail. So applause to you, Amtrak and Acela, or whatever it's called. All right, let's look at some specific states and what they don't have going on in terms of HSR. California received funding in 2008 for a high-speed rail system, but the development of the project has been fraught with overruns and delays, which is par for the course for U.S. infrastructure projects, yet the project remains underway. Let us take a look at this debacle through a quote from Onsman22. Quote, state legislatures agreed last month to release $4.2 billion earmarked for the train's first phase between mid-sized cities Bakersfield, Fresno, and Merced. The project may also benefit from more than $2 billion of federal bipartisan infrastructure law funds set aside for passenger rail. Extending service to the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles would boost the amount of track to 500 miles and the train's total price tag to as much as $105 billion. That's far above an initial estimate of about $40 billion when California voters approved it, when they approved a bond measure to help build it in 2008. End quote. There is a company in Texas called Central Texas that was made to build Texas's first HSR connecting Dallas and Houston. However, the company has ran into funding issues, management issues, and importantly, legal issues to gain the right to impose eminent domain over acquired land. Although I don't have any evidence, any cards cut for eminent domain, I should mention it here. Eminent domain simply refers to a company, or usually the government's right to take away land from businesses, farmers, homeowners, or other private landowners that's needed to build infrastructure projects like HSR lines. So they plan it along some route, your house sits on that route, they can take your house. That's what eminent domain means. This right is often invoked for government projects, but obviously it doesn't sit well with property owners forced to sell their land, and sometimes their houses, to the government. In any case, Central Texas did win the lawsuit to gain eminent domain powers, but it's not clear if investment still exists for them to go ahead with this project. Florida. Florida also has a privately funded line being built by the train company Brightline. This company briefly used the name Virgin Trains for branding, so you may see some evidence using that name. But they backed out of the naming deal after COVID did what COVID does. So now it's just Brightline again. The current train line is not technically high speed, it's just a train, albeit a pretty nice train. But future lines from the same company are projected to hit, they plan to hit that magical 200 kilometer per hour mark. According to Rubio22, these trains are run on eco-friendly biofuels. Although, if you've ever debated biofuels, you'll know they're actually horrible for the environment, so be careful about using that as a selling point. Last, the Florida high-speed corridor, a more ambitious HSR line that was planned, was canceled. So here is sort of the state of three of our big states. There are many plans, thoughts, upgrades in other parts of the country, but again, we have one true line, DSLA. Finally, future plans. Various maps have been drawn up and preliminary standards have been put in place for a country-wide system. You can read more about it in the US Department of Transportation's HSR strategic plan from 2009 under Obama, who, like Biden, was pretty gung-ho about HSR. As you can see from this map, the plans usually are phased, with regional sections connecting major cities, then lines to connect those regions, and eventually, a really intercontinental high-speed network, eventually. But again, for pro, you don't have to advocate picture number 4 here. You can be advocating picture number 1. Picture number 1 is certainly already substantial investment. Okay, let's get into the arguments, shall we? I've broken down pro into 2 major categories, benefits to the country and benefits to riders. We'll touch on each of these in turn and then go over a couple arguments on status quo from the pros perspective and solvency for HSR buildup. Mint tea. High-speed trains are low-emission alternatives to planes and cars that offer economic benefits to the country, revitalization to cities, and a quality-of-life upgrade to riders while drastically reducing carbon emissions. With Europe and Asia enjoying the benefits of HSR investment, America is long overdue to follow suit. First, benefits to the country and to the world. HSR is a classic green technology, operating on electricity from overhead lines rather than gas or oil, like cars and trucks. And indeed, the US has a problem with both gas consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. The Center for American Progress pegs the number at 25% of the world's oil consumption as of 2010. That is with the US only having about 6% of the world's population. So 6% of the world's population, 25% of the world's oil consumption. US Department of Transportation, 2009, quote, "The nation's current transportation system consumes 70% of our oil demand, much of it from overseas sources, and contributes 28% of greenhouse gas emissions." The number you see on the right for transportation portion of greenhouse gas emissions is slightly lower at 27%. This may be a bit more accurate now, although I don't know the sources. In any case, if our goal with HSR is to decrease emissions, China has led the way in showing that it's possible, with Lin et al. 21 showing less highway use after implementing HSR, and Nature Climate Change 21 saying, quote, "Expansion of the high-speed rail network in China between 2008 and 2016 led to a significant reduction in carbon emissions from its transport sector," end quote. So in terms of pure energy efficiency, HSR is more efficient than both cars and planes. But remember that cars are getting their energy from burning gasoline, and planes get it from burning petrochemicals as well, not from the electricity grid, meaning that in terms of power use, comparing their efficiency might not always be the right move. One important consideration here, much like that of electric cars, is where exactly the power is coming from. After all, if the electricity for your HSR is coming from a coal-fired power plant rather than nuclear or solar or the like, it's still dirty power, right? Although emissions from a small car engine are much greater per power output than coal power plants, which due to their size are much more efficient. So even if you have electric cars or electric trains and they're all being powered by coal power plants, it's still actually much better than cars. This, by the way, emissions and energy, is probably Pro's best argument, at least the best obvious one, and we'll therefore next look at how Con can answer it. Joff 17 says that given the extreme emissions of construction projects as massive as a high-speed rail network, overall emissions wouldn't go down by much at all. He also indicts studies from a California HSR commission that he says wildly overestimate ridership numbers. Joff goes on to say in an article from 2021, I didn't have room for that here, that, quote, "Given the California rail project's delays and carbon reductions being achieved by new technology, like electric vehicles, it is possible that, if built, the rail system will never pay back the carbon investment required to build it." End quote. A further point on examples taken from China is that their emissions dropped due to more goods being transported on regular rail instead of on trucks. So regular rail better than trucks for emissions. But this was only possible because passengers who previously were using regular rail all the time switched to HSR, thus freeing up more freight room on regular rail. However, the US has very little rail ridership in the status quo, so we wouldn't expect those same emissions effects here. Last depressing point is that the effects of climate change are well underway, and if there's any pipe dreams that HSR will stop climate change's forward march, well, France Press 20 would like to shoot them down because, we stop all emissions today. Climate change is still wildly out of control. HSR is not going to cut into it that much, if at all. That's emissions and energy. Next, on trade and supply. Let's start with a quote from Weight 21. Quote, "High-speed rail connections have important spillover effects in supporting an extensive supply chain in manufacturing industry, which creates new companies. There's a link here to jobs. HSR provides access to jobs and provides companies access to more workers. However, HSR is typically used for passenger use, where speed is a bigger priority than for freight, and not for hauling goods. HSR is not used for hauling goods in most cases. More specifically, the Economic Times 21 talks about China's potential use of HSR to mobilize troops and to transport missiles as part of war infrastructure. So, a quote here from Economic Times, quote, "While bringing convenience to the lives of the masses, high-speed rail also plays a military role that is growing more prominent by the day. A lightly equipped division could be moved on the Wuhan to Guangzhou line about 600 miles in 5 hours, a fairly rapid mobilization in military terms." They go on to say that China's high-speed rail network will provide immense strategic military value, and the 2nd Artillery Missile Forces could use the high-speed rail network to quickly deploy short-range missiles, end quote. Lastly, larger economic benefits are realized when you consider rail lines to Canada and Mexico, both of which are under planning stages. And the benefit that further connecting our North American island, these 3 big countries, to business and trade. But of course, this argument is also important, so we need to have some rebuttals for it. Now, these rebuttals are really just the ones I have cards for. That's why I'm including some rebuttals and not on others. So 2 cards talk about 2 holes we're in. Wiseman 22 on the inflation and economic hole, and Jung 22 on the supply chain hole. The cards say, respectively, that HSR is not the shovel to dig us out of either hole. So, HSR will not fix supply chain issues and will not fix the economy. HSR may have immense benefits to the country, not from Khan's point of view, obviously, pro supply and trade, immense benefits to the country, but how about to the passengers that use it? Let's talk about ridership benefits next. The experience of riding on modern HSRs is at least as pleasant as it seems. The most obvious benefit is simply that you're not driving, which takes focus and work, although again, most of you probably don't drive, but some of you do. Maybe it's fun for you, I don't know. For most people, as you know, it's not like fun to drive hours at a time or to drive 1 hour at a time if that's your commute every day. Instead, on an HSR, you can use your commute to work, to sleep, or in my experience, to watch TikTok, freeing up your commute time, or at least a big part of it, which is invaluable. Weight 21 quantifies these time-saving benefits in reference to traffic congestion. Quote, "Delays caused by traffic congestion alone cost the U.S. economy over $120 billion per year," end quote. HSRs also improve urban livability. This is Zhao et al. 22, quote, "HSR opening improves urban livability by promoting economic growth, talent agglomeration, and industrial structure upgrading," end quote. In addition, when transportation hubs are used as community centers, car ownership can drop, cities become more walkable, and urban centers can become more dense, leading to less city sprawl and better cities. This is called transportation-oriented development. Now, US cities are built around cars, not around public transport, but this is a dream that HSR can help us to achieve. Lastly, Eaton 19 and Fruc 21, not Fruc 19, Fruc 21, I think Fruc 21, talk about giving people more options to housing by providing convenient and high-speed transportation. This access reduces housing costs as more options become available, and also increases quality of life for those who wish to work in cities, but not to live in those same big cities. Here's Eaton, quote, "Japan's rail network allowed lower-wage workers to access exurban areas where housing development is less expensive. While areas close to stations experienced price increases, in general, prefectures linked by rail were more affordable than they would have been without rail. What happens is you have effectively increased the size of the city." Quality of life. Next, let's talk about jobs. HSR also provides jobs for planners and construction workers,
And long-term jobs for maintenance engineers, operations workers like train drivers, sanitation workers, a slew of other things you never think about. Examples from California show massive numbers. Up to 450,000 permanent jobs may be created by California HSR, and many of those jobs will go to low-income and disadvantaged workers. As we've already touched on, HSR can also provide access to jobs, increasing options for workers and spurring economic growth. However, it's not just workers who benefit, it's also the companies they go to work for. From Wait 21, quote, with many companies deciding that a full remote working or twice a week in the office policy is not only feasible, but better for a number of well-being and productivity outcomes, high-speed rail could offer more choice and options for workers and more access to talent for employers, end quote. Next, let's talk about safety. Maybe not your first thought, but maybe one of your thoughts. HSR trains have been operating safely around the world for decades, and accidents are few and far between. Where there is an accident, it's thoroughly studied, and the wisdom of whatever went awry is integrated into safety protocols and technology, much as rare plane accidents are. Indeed, Japan has, in 6 years of HSR use, again, had 0 passenger fatalities. But of course, the US is definitely not Japan. In Taiwan, whose culture is similar to Japan in important ways, there's no ID check, no security line, no bag scanning, and also no problems with the system. It just works, everyone's safe, everyone feels safe, it's fine. I should note China has both ID checks and baggage checks, so this is not universal. But in the US, with our strong gun culture and strong domestic terrorism culture and largely unaddressed mental health crisis, we would expect a good deal of trouble. Sadly, as Murillo 12 points out, the TSA has almost completely ignored train safety, although it falls under their mandate, and is unprepared to handle an HSR rollout. Furthermore, if we did put in place the security measures that would be needed to keep passengers safe, it would negate many of the time savings benefits about having the HSR in the first place, right? If you've got to spend an hour in security before you get on the train, like why not just go to the airport? Deal with the same thing. Lastly, for pro, let's talk about the status quo and solvency. Compared to Europe and Japan and China, the US has miserably low rail ridership. Could this be because the rail system is also so out of date and underfunded? That is one theory. Free remark 21. US intercity rail is underused. Though Canadians ride trains at a similar rate compared with France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, the US stands out. Japanese residents, for example, travel an average of almost 1,300 miles on intercity rail annually, compared with just 24 miles for Americans. One explanation for the difference is that the US has invested little in its rail system, routinely far less than in other nations. The United Kingdom spends about 6 times as much per capita on its railways. Final note on solvency, there are many issues with HSR feasibility, end quote. UK, 6 times as much per capita on its railways. A final note on solvency, there are many issues with HSR feasibility that Khan will bring up. It costs too much, nobody would use it, it could damage the environment, etc. But remember that HSR has been successfully used for decades around the world. Starting this late in the game, the US is in a perfect position to capitalize on the experience of these other countries. That's it for pro. Next, on to con. But first, mint tea. Lukewarm mint tea. Look, HSR does work in some countries, but it's ill-suited for America, where our extensive highway system, car-first culture, and low train ridership would ensure failure of any HSR project. America is also far too large and sparsely populated for it to make sense, especially when alternatives exist, like upgrading normal rail or improving bus systems. Again, for con, there are a couple of major categories here. Disadvantages of HSR buildup to the country, disadvantages to the cities the HSR passes through, and then, again, we'll look at some alternatives. How you can capture many of the benefits the pro team wants without also facing the disadvantages that HSR brings along. Last, we'll talk about solvency, several reasons HSR just won't work in America. First, country disads. This picture, by the way, was taken from an Amtrak derailment in Washington. It was the very first run of a quote-unquote high-speed rail with top speeds of 128 kilometers per hour. So that's not a good sign. If we can't handle 128 kilometers per hour, I don't know how we're going to handle 200. Let's talk about cost. The cost of building an HSR system in the US is almost incomprehensibly immense. Yarrow 09 puts the number for a nationwide network at $500 billion. And even for smaller regional projects, costs can run as high as $100 million per mile. That's Wagon 21. And this is a number taken from California's ill-fated attempts at HSR construction. As you can see in the graph, neither China nor Europe spend anywhere close to that amount of money on HSR. Part of the issue is that, frankly, the US kind of sucks at building infrastructure, and any major project is almost necessarily racked by delays and cost overruns. Here's a quote from Ditch 21. Washington's bureaucracy increases costs, add delays, and reduces accountability. State and local politicians don't have to worry about pinching pennies when they get handouts from Uncle Sam, which leads to eye-popping costs for basics like employing bus drivers and building elevators. End quote. California's rail project is a perfect example of something designed, that was not the end quote. Continuing the quote, California's rail project is a perfect example of something designed to maximize political benefits rather than the public good. They plan to ultimately have 27 stations, most in small cities that would have minimal demand. Marginal stations add to overall construction costs, while dramatically reducing how long the trains can spend at top speeds. That means taxpayers get mediocre average speeds, but have to pay a premium for the high-speed infrastructure. End quote. And money is just part of the problem. The other major cost is time. And when it comes to infrastructure projects, successful projects must be built efficiently. Importantly, if it takes decades for HSR projects to begin running, we will live in a very different world than the world of today. For example, our country's car fleet could be fully electric and fully autonomous, thus removing any of the benefits of comfort, emission, and safety that the HSR promises. And those time delays are almost guaranteed in America. Here's O'Toole 21. Because of cost overruns in the pandemic, the authorities now project completion no earlier than 2033, nearly 40 years after planning began. Not all high-speed rails may take this long, but 2 decades seems a likely minimum. A lot will happen in 2 or more decades that could completely nullify the claimed benefits of high-speed rail. The pandemic is likely to reduce people's eagerness to use various forms of mass transit, even after most people are vaccinated. Driverless cars will reduce the cost of travel time because people will be able to work, socialize, or enjoy entertainment while they travel in personal vehicles. Electric aircraft could reduce the dollar and environmental cost of short-distance air travel. These and other uncertainties make big-budget, high-risk projects even less likely to succeed. So, costs everywhere. Big costs everywhere for HSR. Let's look at some answers to this cost argument. The federal government would play a necessary role in bringing a large HSR project to fruition, but it wouldn't be the only player. Private investments, commercialization, and judiciously choosing only those city pairs likely to generate high returns on investment can all ensure that the money is well used. After all, even the wildest fans of HSR are not suggesting we dive headfirst into a New York City to San Francisco line. Let's ease into it. And if debt is an issue, yes, of course major infrastructure requires spending money. Of course it does. But in real economic terms, the US government borrowing money in US dollars doesn't really matter. It's insane, but it's true. We're not going to default on our debt. We make the dollars. Instead, as Strapes 19 argues, we should simply spend money on whatever projects are likely to be worthwhile and to benefit Americans. Not all of the rebuttals to cost, but a couple of the rebuttals to cost. So, back in con mode, costs way too much money. Now, these immense costs of building an HSR wouldn't matter quite so much if it was going to be useful. I admit, fine, we spend a lot of money, people use it. You know, maybe it's worth bankrupting the country, I don't know. But yeah, it's not going to work. First reason is low ridership. As we mentioned before, Europe, Japan, and China all had high train ridership before HSR was introduced. Selling train riders on faster trains is obviously not hard, but America is different. In the status quo, there are few train users, and according to data from China, Hunan University 19, people aren't likely to give up their cars. So trying to get people to go from driving or flying to riding on a train is a gamble. And when it comes to $500 billion projects that are almost certain to fail for other reasons, we shouldn't be gambling. Another factor that sets the US apart is population density. It's simply low compared to the countries where HSR has worked. Here is Roderick 13. The density of North American urban areas, including their city centers, is low enough to challenge the justification for large-scale HSR projects. End quote. And Millsap. There are many things working against a US HSR system: geography, relatively low population density, and greater competition from cars and planes than in other countries. These factors still present issues for HSR. Some will argue that national population density is not the appropriate statistic to consider, since HSR is designed to connect dense cities to one another. But US cities are not very dense either. New York is America's densest big city at 27,000 people per square mile. Well below Seoul, 43,000 per square mile, Shanghai, 35,000 per square mile, or Paris, 53,000 per square mile, end quote. Finally, infrastructure around the world will take a beating from climate change, including the floods, droughts, wildfires, and extreme temperatures that have and will continue to be brought by climate change. In the face of impending climactic doom, this seems like the wrong time to be investing in massive infrastructure projects. Quote from Campbell 22. Much of the world still relies heavily on railroads to move people and products, but railway infrastructure, from overhead wires to tracks, is at high risk from climate change and associated extreme weather. Without efforts to adapt to future climate threats, the railway industry will face degrading infrastructure, safety hazards, and skyrocketing operation costs, say experts in transportation planning and civil engineering. Now, let's look at a couple rebuttals. On ridership, Berg 21 suggests that people can be enticed to ride HSRs, and it makes sense that our ridership is currently so minimal. After all, our train system is awful. Again, for any American who wants to feel some patriotism for their country, like myself, truly, like myself, our public transport system and lack of HSRs is just straight up embarrassing. But if you build it, they may come. And the success of the Acela line in the Northeast Corridor is certainly a promising example. So maybe the reason we don't have high ridership is the bad rails. If we make good rails, probably people will ride them. On climate degradation. Yes, we should be aware in every policy decision of what's coming down the pipe climactically. It is a paradigm shift, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. China, with its huge network operating across extreme topographical and geographical conditions, has resilient trains and has pioneered train technology for extreme weather conditions. From Pike 19 on China's cold-resistant trains, I'm gonna mispronounce some of these words. This is science here. Pike 19, quote, in a post on Chinese social media, the China Railway Beijing Group ran through several of the train's optimized components that aid its ability to withstand cold temperatures. These include bolts made with chromium molybdenum alloy, a material that ensures extremely low temperatures, silicone sealing strips, which prevent snow and ice from getting into the train body, temperature-resistant brake control devices, and stainless steel pipes equipped with heating devices. The train also features a streamlined, low-resistance design to help decrease energy consumption and a lightweight aluminum alloy body. End quote. Wasn't so bad. Next, on to environmental damage, of which there will be plenty. Here's some quotes from the three authors listed here. Here's Cox 19 and talking about HSR development in Maryland. Conservationists say that inside the refuge, the project would destroy wildlife habitat, upend wetlands, and possibly require the rerouting of streams. I can't find words strong enough to express what I feel, said Marsha Watson, president of the Patuxet Bird Club. It's an environmental disaster in the making. I'm outraged that a private company thinks it can waltz in here and take our land. The same reaction, of course, may be easily multiplied by 1 million if we had 1 million conservationists set up ready to observe this construction with any large-scale development. DeWee 19, quote, potential threats to endangered species, diesel emissions from construction equipment, and wetland impacts are a few of the obstacles the High-Speed Rail Authority must confront. And lastly, Lynn et al. 19, from studying the Chinese system, the top 3 sectors that contribute to pollutant emissions are the metal smelting and rolling industry, transport equipment manufacturing, and non-metallic mineral production. CO2 and NOx are the major pollutants directly emitted by site equipment operation. So, turns out it is kind of hard to be green. So that is why the HSR will destroy the country. Now let's talk about why HSR will destroy cities. New HSR lines won't just hurt the environment or the nation's taxpayer, who will foot the bill for these rails to nowhere. The cities the line passes through will also be made worse, first by gentrification, then by suburban sprawl. Gentrification is the process by which low-income neighborhoods with low-income people are gradually made more expensive, usually by people and businesses moving in to take advantage of the low prices. As richer people move in, poorer people must move out as the prices rise. And this is what HSRs lead to, the displacement of the vulnerable. From Lin and Xie 20, increased accessibility in land prices can result in the displacement of lower rent affordability activities by higher rent affordability activities, also known as gentrification. Industrial displacement occurs when originally existing industries near HSR station areas are displaced by newly moving in industries. Industrial gentrification is likely to occur when the displaced industries are the lower skill or lower wage types. This industry upgrading process is expected to raise economic growth, but can also endanger local economic diversity and employment outcomes of unskilled and immigrant workers. In reply, though, as we've just seen, the HSR also gives access to more jobs and lower housing costs. So while it may inflict pain on some people, Pro can definitely reply that the net benefits are far greater to everyone with access to the line. Next, sprawl. Suburban sprawl is the process by which cities spread out, with people building houses in beautiful, quiet places outside the city, the same places where birds and trees used to live. This leads to environmental degradation, to pollution, to habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation for the animals, and for the plants and the fungi who share our earth. And HSRs lead to more of this. From Kambitsis 10. Despite the promise of creating more densely populated urban centers, HSR do quite the opposite by making it easier for people to live far from urban centers. End quote. There's plenty we can do for our cities in America, but building HSR is just not it. All right. Next for con, let's look at some alternatives. Because this is the first topic of the year, and some of you may be new to PF, I should give my usual disclaimer before this section. I think my video just cut off, but I did not expect this to be an hour-long lecture. I thought it would be 30 minutes. I had 40 minutes of SD card left, and it is all gone now. So here's the disclaimer about alternatives. In public forum, Khan cannot advocate for a counterplan or a different course of action than what's being proposed. However, if better alternatives exist, it may be good to mention, not as your main contention, but as a reply to a pro team that might insist that HSR is a do or die. Indeed, it's not at all a necessary choice given that there's so many other ones. A notable exception to this rule: if you can show that HSR investment precludes investment in these other things, like these other things definitely won't get the money if it goes to HSR instead, then you can use them as a case argument. So if you don't really understand anything that I just talked about, please ask your coach or another debater or r/debate on Reddit for how to use alternatives in public forum. Depending on your coach, they might just tell you not to watch debate track videos anymore. Freeways. The US has a famously robust freeway system. It's a deep part of our country's history and an effective way to move goods and people. However, it could be much improved. Again, here's O'Toole 21, quote, "The Texas A&M Transportation Institute estimates that congestion in America's 494 urban areas wasted 8.8 billion hours of travelers' time and 3.3 billion gallons of fuel, and cost $179 billion in 2017. The financial reason to build new freeways is simple. New freeways, if located in the right places and priced properly, can pay for themselves. This is unlike high-speed rail or any passenger rail in the US, which require both operating and capital subsidies," end quote. So if we're going to invest, let it be in the freeway system that's foundational to our country. But that's not the only alternative. Regular trains may be less sexy than the high-speed ones, but we do already have 140,000 miles of track for them. As we saw in the background section, there are many technological improvements we can make to these tracks and rolling stock to increase their speed. Electronic signaling, concrete ties, or making track curves more shallow, just to name a few. Would more people ride the trains if they were better? It'd be a risky gamble, but it'd be a far less pricey gamble than HSR. Here is Gordon 21, quote, "So, at the heart of this HSR question is not would it be good, but rather a more strategic issue. Do we take the lower risk, lower reward path to drastically improve the rail infrastructure we already have? Or do we go with the big swing and try to start all over with high-speed rail? We have a passenger rail network. It sucks right now, but we can make it better a lot easier than we can build a new one," end quote. And here's a final alternative. Private investment. As we've seen, and as we'll see again, the US system is just not set up for successful large-scale infrastructure. China is, and we're not China. With our system, we'll be better at some things, like human rights, and less good at many other things, like infrastructure. This is the price we pay for keeping our values. One thing we're great at, though, is business. And if HSR can be delivered successfully and efficiently to the market without burdening taxpayers with inevitable failure, perhaps it should be done. Here's Lindsay et al. 21. Quote, "A high-speed rail strategy based solely on Amtrak's government-operated train service is doomed to fail. The United States has an abysmal track record when it comes to government-run passenger rail service. Amtrak operates year after year at a loss, costing U.S. taxpayers nearly $100 billion since its inception. Government control over rail construction projects has resulted in endless delays, massive cost overruns, and minimal return on taxpayer investment. However," Lindsay goes on to say, "modern-day rail entrepreneurs have the ability to make prudent investment decisions that are free from the political compromises that delay and inevitably increase the cost of government-controlled projects," end quote. So if we want the advantages of HSR, we just might be able to get them. But using the federal government for investment is clearly a poor choice. Okay, let us go to solvency. In this final section, we'll talk solvency. Two major reasons HSR won't work. First is interest opposition. Political corruption, I believe there's a card in the brief. I won't mention that too much. I won't talk about it here. But interest opposition. The US is a somewhat corrupt country, with money playing a major role in shaping US policy. That's also the case for HSR, where automotive, oil and gas, and airline groups push hard to prevent an HSR from coming to fruition. You can find that discussion in Tabucchi 18 and in our two source blocks at the very end of the packet that reveal how these corrupt dollars have flowed into certain pockets. Now, as always, Pro has fiat power. We can assume for the purposes of this debate that the US can invest in HSR, and we're discussing if that potential world would be better or worse than this one. So we're not assuming here that this interest opposition can actually stop the HSR. Whether an HSR is likely in America is not really the point of this debate. But given the big money opposition to public transit investments, investing more money into HSR could be a huge waste of time and money, given all of the many roadblocks that the opposition will put in path of the train. And second, the US system. Political gridlock and a host of special interest groups make any attempt at an HSR extremely difficult. This is from Mortimer 20, quote, "The legal obstacles in opposition to high-speed rail may have had benevolent intentions when first passed, but are lethal to any inspiring high-speed rail project. Environmental reviews make construction an expensive endeavor before shovels even start moving dirt. Sturdy property rights make the acquisition of privately owned land expensive and lengthy, a problem that countries like China do not face. A culture of public input makes every inch of track an issue worthy of public hearings and comment. Contractors and their unions know all too well how to extract money from public entities who don't know any better to turn the tap off. These are problems so large that they cannot be solved by any transit authority alone. They are deeply ingrained local, state, and federal laws that breed a culture that demands too many cooks in the kitchen. The result is an accumulation of cost overruns and delays that kill once ambitious projects." That is it for Khan. That is it for this lecture. That, my friends, is it. I hope you enjoyed debating this topic. Remember to always be kind to yourself, be kind to others. Remember, as a debater and as a human being, that your words have power, have real power for good and bad. And remember to leave a comment. Farewell, and I will see you back here in about 2 months. Bye-bye.